Welcome everybody. So we are very excited today to have like the first WEFI seminar of 2024, and we'll start with Chien Grennan, who has a very interesting paper co-authored with Colleen, Chien, and Rem Koning will do the discussion. So as usual, so if you can turn on your video, it makes like the seminar much more, interactive, especially for the speaker. So if you have questions, so you can drop them in the chat. You can raise your hand as well. So Colleen will answer some of the question, or if you really want to ask your question directly, you can raise your hand and we'll pause for questions throughout the seminar. And if we have some extra time at the end, we'll also take additional questions. Yeah, so Gillian, so the floor is yours, so you can share your slides and start.
Great. So thank you so much for having me here. And this is joint work with Colleen, Chien at Berkeley Law. I'm at Berkeley Haas, and we're both part of the Diversity Pilots Initiative, which is sort of exciting work on this agenda that we're going to present. And so unpacking the innovator-inventor gap, I think the really big motivation is understanding what is this innovator-inventor gap. And so there's a substantial gap between STEM professionals where very few transition to being named inventors, and it's particularly true for STEM workers from underrepresented groups. So for instance, Black professionals represent 9% of STEM workers, but only 1.2% of inventors. Similarly, females represent 35% of STEM workers, but only 13% of inventors. And we know this from sort of the work of the USPTO, but more generally, more recently, my co-author in a forthcoming paper at UCLA Law Review basically took what most people had focused on was the average women inventor rate. And if you look at it, you would see it's mostly these firms at the top that are sort of health firms. So Procter & Gamble or Bristol Myers Squibb, Abbott Labs, which is not surprising because women tend to go more into the bio and chemistry side of STEM. But what she actually shows is that if you put the number of women in technical roles, so sort of creating, again, the same STEM workforce relative to the innovators, there are actually this difference between the gray and black. There's these big substantial variations. And what's really interesting is it varies so much across top patenting firms, okay? So where there's gaps as big as like 35% at Caterpillar and Microsoft, and there's like hardly any gap at firms like AT&T. Okay, and so this makes us think maybe we need to go look inside the firm, right? Little is really known about the internal firm dynamics that lead to patent applications being filed or not, yet we know who patents or doesn't is consequential for technological change, for economic growth, and really the direction and reach of innovation. So a lot of our Discussant Rem's work, as well as Matt Marks and others. Further, we know that if women, minorities, and children from low-income families actually receive patents at the same rate as white men from high-income families, so this is the Lost Einstein's papers, we would have 4 times as many inventors in the US. And so thinking through sort of all of these motivations, it led us to ask what factors really help or hurt this conversion of innovators into inventors. Okay, and does the innovator-inventor gap basically reflect sort of an efficient filtering process at firms? Or should it be a cause for concern? Are we perhaps losing some, the lost Rembrandts or some of these other important marginal innovations? And so we're going to basically examine management practices, culture, motivation, employee traits, basically all the things that happen internally within the firm that we don't really often get to look at and think about them in a much more detailed manner. So we can sort of create a pecking order of these factors and understand what matters the most. And to do this, we're going to take a really large mix of administrative and survey data. Okay, so what exactly do we do? We actually just started with sort of interview and survey. This is definitely a mixed methods paper. I have done a lot of interview and survey work before. And so we interviewed a bunch of patent professionals to understand what was going on. And then we also surveyed high-tech engineers to learn about innovators, not just inventors. And so we were very careful to try and get the much broader swath rather than just going to the people who had applied for a patent. We used this to create a model that's really just a stylized model to think about how many engineers might allocate their time and effort to invention. And one of the things we want to do here is pick up on some of the things that we heard about from the professionals that wasn't necessarily what we were seeing reflected in common models. And then our data is going to be For the survey part, it's going to be 3,898 survey responses from 5 firms, about a response rate of about 15%, but we have really big firms in the sample. So, you're going to think of some of the largest firms in our economy. And so when we did survey, only 1 firm did we send it to most people, and the rest of the firms, it was a very selected sample where we worked with HR departments. And then the next thing that's really cool is we have what these firms call their invention disclosure database. But when they say invention disclosure, what it really is ideas submitted. Okay, and so we have 69,513 unique ideas submitted by 31,585 engineers at 4 firms. And it sort of confirms this first female innovator-inventor gap, but then it also helps us understand the factors contributing to it. Then we try to sort of generalize the data, look at its robustness by validating sort of external in the USPTO. Most recent in December, they put up a new US gendered patent data set. And so we're looking at their better disambiguated one and matching it with things like Glassdoor, where we can get a culture and management rating to sort of understand if the patterns we're seeing in these firms may generalize. So what do we find? First, we find that it really is a super competitive process, probably not surprising to people in academia, but it is not this like joyous collaborative process. It's very competitive. It is opt-in at many firms. And so only about 1/3 of engineers actually even submit ideas for patenting. And sort of just half of those lead to patent applications being filed. Right? So there's certainly failures. There's the dog that didn't bark that goes before we even get to the filing process. And then the other thing is they're going to be wide heterogeneity. And even though we focused very much on high-tech firms, so we just shouldn't think of this heterogeneity being driven by technology differences. We should think of like there's wide heterogeneity just within firms who do very, very similar things. Okay. So what's then contributing to this innovator-inventor gap? Well, the first thing we learn is that the women have a distinct disadvantage throughout the process. And we actually don't find the same evidence for a gap for underrepresented minorities. And so I would suggest maybe looking more into this for others interested in the topic. And then when we go into the pecking order, we look at a bunch of things. And what we're finding is that management practices sort of come out loud and clear as the #1 factor. And then culture actually comes in as the 3rd most influential factor. And so it suggests these things that firms can very much change. While it's hard, they can change them, are things that would really improve innovative output. And so that's sort of what our last part is to say, is this idea filtering process efficient? We would argue that no. And so this is when we start to look at these firms that have heavy frictions, and we see that the patents to their female inventors receive more citations and are more likely to be in the upper decile of citations received. Okay, and so what this is suggesting to us is that, the quality of the marginal ideal loss to frictions is very high. Okay, and then we try to generalize these results, and we do show similar patterns at all public firms with what we would call invention process frictions attributable to ineffective management and culture. Okay, so the rest of the roadmap of the paper, I'm just going to dive into the background so we can sort of explain what this process is like, because a lot of it was stuff that I didn't know until I started doing these interviews, and then go into the administrative and survey data, get into the pecking order of factors influencing the gap, and then why does the gender gap matter, sort of what ideas are we losing, and then conclude. Okay, so the way, again, 35% STEM workforce, 13% inventor females. What is inside this black box? So we did 13 interviews. Mostly it was connections, but I would say that there was some firms where, you may have heard in the headlines that they are, an awful place for women to work at. We definitely interviewed one of those firms where I wanted to go talk to them. And we also went to a place that's, might be on the best places to work list. And so to try and get some variety and see what we learned. And really the 3 things that distinct processes in which you can think of where we might have failure is basically just even getting to this idea submission part. So this early stage, but it could also be, the review process itself is biased for a variety of reasons. And so it could be going from idea to patent application, or it could be actually defending. There's a lot of back and forth between the patent office and these patent attorneys. It could be maybe you're not responding to rejection as well. we actually heard from the patent attorneys that it certainly seemed to be much more in these early 2 stages, so the idea submission and the patent application phase. So we're going to focus on those. So first, I want to just show you how many different ways there are to submit inventive ideas. So most firms have both a process whereby you can go work with the patent professional directly, but that is something where you'd have to opt in. If maybe you're sort of more of a shy person, you can also go through these anonymous portals, so IDF submission portals. Okay, there's also the sense that you can do it as part of a team, but again, that would be opting in. You could go to these, brainstorming, mining sessions, whatever they want to call it, a hackathon. They have a bunch of these ideation events. Ideation events can be led by patent professionals, so think of attorneys, or they can be led by senior engineers. So any one of these 3 ways, you're going to go to what's typically an initial review process. So most firms seem to have a 2-step process. This initial review, you might get feedback here and a chance to update. Some firms you would not get a chance to update. Okay. And then it would go to the patent review board and the IP legal review. Okay. And here's where it could be potentially put on hold. It could be closed. It could have also been closed at the initial review stage, or you get a patent application applied for. And so then that's going to go to, potentially hiring an external law firm, having more meetings, having the application reviewed and filed and then prosecuted, and eventually getting a patent issued if all of these steps go well, or having the file closed. And so I think the one thing for me to think about is it was not a uniform process, and there's clearly seems to be a lot of arrows, which suggest potential for friction just in the submission process. Okay. The other idea is to think about way before the submission process, right? And so sort of the baseline numbers we were telling you is about a 50% conversion from to a patent application of the idea even getting here. Well, you could have ideas coming from individuals. You also have ideas coming from teams and brainstorming sessions. Okay. We know from sort of the Chetty papers, this early life exposure matters. So wealth, gender, geography. There's a lot of reasons to believe once you've selected into a firm, you're pretty similar, right? You have similar training and skills. And so maybe then it's more things like career-life balance or other individual traits such as your risk-taking, confidence, perfectionism. But it could be also sort of what we know from the institutional economics literature. We have formal institutions and informal institutions. The formal institutions are things like your management practices, your incentives, your training sessions, things that can be formalized. And then your informal institutions are things like culture. So really, do you have trustworthy co-authors to collaborate with? Do you embrace adaptability at your firm? All of these factors are sort of going into selecting what to submit. And then again, we can have more frictions in this invention process, how simple it is, the review process, how biased it is, stuff like that. So this led us to think about a model. And I see that there are getting to be questions. I don't know if it's a good time to take a break. No? Okay, cool. All right, so we are getting into our model of time and effort. And one of the key things about our model is that you want to sort of allocate time, but recognize that part of allocating your time is to understand the patent worthiness of your idea, right? And so we heard that there's a lot of variance both in the feedback received and how hard it is for people to understand if it's a really good idea or if it's not that great of an idea. And sort of what we do is we build into this model that, well, your higher pay, so you would get a reward. It's fairly common. Some of the rewards are much lower than at some firms than at other firms. Okay, but you would get an award. So we incentivize it sort of like pay, but this additional, you're trading off pay with other factors. And in particular, you have part of your effort is going to be conditional on, refining this signal. And so really there's costs though to refining that signal. And this cost can be influenced by many of these factors we just showed in the model. So these informal and formal factors, because we put our cost as something that's not sort of a traditional, how much is your R&D budget, but more about this tacit knowledge that you get about the inventive process and about specific ideas. And so effort can reduce the noise signal on the quality of the idea, but this effort is also costly. And so what this leads to is sort of an optimal effort, okay, where the success rate is positively related to the rate at which the probability of success increases with effort. But it's not just that, like, hey, I received a better idea in the front and then I know I'm going to submit it because I knew it was more patent worthy. You could actually get noise coming into your process simply by the informal processes in the firm, even if you received a very good idea, which would lead maybe females or people who might get more frictions to not submit an idea. And really, this is sort of the whole idea of our model, is that all drivers of effort have the potential to differ by gender and ethnicity. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go into our administrative and survey data to understand what we actually see. So to give you a sense of these firms, and I did suggest they're big high-tech Silicon Valley firms, they're certainly more revenue. So I benchmarked them to the public patenting firms and the CompuStat firms. So it's 6 times more revenue than even public patenting firms, 16 times more than CompuStat, way more employees, 2 times more employees, 3 times more than CompuStat, more R&D and patents. It's 16 times more R&D and public patents than, and 17 times more that applied for patents. Similar profitability in Tobin's Q, similar patent value in citations. And then finally, our patent classes, they're going to skew towards telecom, digital communications, computer tech, and optics, but I think that's what you would think of sort of Silicon Valley high tech. Okay. And then geography, many of these are multinational firms, and so we are going to have a diverse engineer pool. 38% are in North America, with 1/3 from the US. 28% are in East Asia. We have Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Europe. We have 22% females, so a little bit below the STEM average. I think that could be a little bit of the people who didn't report their gender. We didn't force them to report a gender, but it's not inconsistent with what the sample targets were from talking to the HR reps. 77% are Asian, that's internationally. If we would go look within the US, it's 45% Asian, 45% white, 5% Latinx, or 2%, and then 3% multiracial and 1% Black. So sort of similar a little bit to some of the things we've seen before. And think of the average person as a 41-year-old engineer with 7 years of experience. Most have a graduate degree, so roughly half have a master's degree. Okay, and then the business units are mostly just pure engineering, but about 1/4 are data science, and then some more manufacturing and product or sales and strategy. Okay, so the first thing I want to go to is thinking about from solving problems to inventive ideas. And this was one thing that was really striking to me in the data, is that 96% of engineers all uniformly agreed that I am a problem solver, and there was no demographic difference. Yet if you ask them if they were an inventor, sort of similar, right? Similar activities. 46% agreed they were an inventor, but significantly less likely for women to say they were an inventor. Okay, 49% of males identified that way, 35% of females. This could suggest simple framing works for firms thinking about it, of saying, what problems are you working on, as opposed to, what inventions do you have might work. And this is something Colleen has been working on in a follow-up RCT. All inventors are somewhat familiar with the IP process. So this suggests it's not an information or training thing. All of them have, we double-checked with patent attorneys, every single person has been through some type of training, either at orientation or is invited every year to one. 40% said they were aware of the IP tools and processes, no difference, and roughly 45% had attended a training, again, no difference in demographics. Where we start to see differences in this perceived ideation, right? Interest in work that could make you a named inventor, 61% are interested, so there is a little bit of an interest gap, but it varies by gender. So males are more interested than women, but it's only about 7 percentage points. And then have you ever had an idea that you thought might be patentable? 55% overall believe they have, but again, this varies by gender, and this is a little bit larger. So we put this along with other survey questions into what we're calling this falling off the innovator-inventor path. Okay, and so this is the percent you see. This is the combined for everyone. So all engineers solve problems, but then we see it's sharply declined. Have you had an inventive idea? Are you assigned to IP work? So, are you given tasks likely to yield patentable inventions? Have you sought advice from somebody familiar with the patenting process? Have you sought training? Have you actually submitted an idea? And then have you had a patent app filed? So you see this just meaningful drop off in sort of each subsequent step along the way. Okay. And this is for everybody. Now what I'm going to do is show you the relative differences between females in pink and underrepresented minorities in blue. And what we see is this is our first thing where there's this striking difference. Women, 7 percentage points below, 7.7. Every single step, women are behind. In contrast, while underrepresented minorities actually initially don't seem to have say they have fewer inventive ideas, they are actually getting overassigned to IP work relative to representative groups. And that continues all the way to this submitting of ideas. They're much more likely to submit ideas. Okay, so this suggests that, maybe tailoring processes within the firms to different groups if you want to try and get more people off the bench. Okay. So looking at this, we want to then say, hey, let's look at our firm level idea data. Do we see the same thing we're hearing reported in surveys, right? Because surveys could be biased for a variety of reasons. Let's go to actual raw data that these firms have on the ideas submitted. And so we got 4 firms to share their data with us. Okay. Obviously there's a bit of size differences, although I'm not sure if this firm's public, but I know the 1, 2, and 4 are all public firms. Okay. So we're getting a lot of ideas submitted. So typical, I'm going to do the simple mean for now, but about 2.3 inventors, about 32% of them have a first-time inventor on the patent. Okay. And think about how important that first time your experience is, the first time you submitted a paper as an academic. I'm sure it's very similar in the patent process. There's a lot of tacit knowledge being learned. 16% have any female inventor, but the percent is only 9%. Any URM is 9%, and then submitted as a patent app is 59%, but this is the one where it's such wide variation. And so this small firm, and this is sort of probably true as the younger firms in our sense, they're more likely to submit everything than maybe some of the older firms that clearly have some calling process going on already internally when they decide what they don't want to or don't want to submit. And then we see about 41% is our average for patent granted given an application. Okay. So now we use the same administrative idea data, and we're just running a regression to say, hey, do female ideas, what's going on? And we see across each firm, although the sample size would vary, and I should have put the sample size in here. You can think of the big one having more ideas. It's negative at each firm, it's significant at 2 out of the 4, and then when you put all firms together, it's highly significant. So to suggest, being female is correlated with a 5 percentage point decrease in advancing to the next step in the journey process. And so the variable here is do nothing, submit an idea, patent applied for, patent granted. So it's averaged over these steps, but I've done in the appendix, I've broken it down into individual steps, and it's roughly similar. You can get sort of a 9 percentage point estimate in earlier steps. Okay. And we repeat both exercises for UMs, but the evidence is much more mixed, sort of consistent with the graph that we saw. We actually see it as positive and significant at one of the firms and then sort of 0 at the others. So I wouldn't take too much away from that. So ideally, though, you want more controls, right? So this is where we can go back to our survey data and say, hey, wait, you had a whole rich bunch of things that you asked questions about. And so we're using this survey, the engineer data. We had asked the exact same questions about these different steps, right? And we're going to put that in, and then we're going to be able to put in these rich set of controls. And so, for instance, one thing you might think about, can differences in inventive time account for it? And I think it's unlikely, right? Because we find that there's no difference across inventors or innovators in terms of where they allocate their time. We asked them about things likely to lead to invention, unlikely to lead to invention, and sort of non-technical tasks. And they roughly spend 75% of their time on technical tasks. They claim only 15% of that time is likely to lead to an invention. Okay. Similarly, I asked, I've thought a lot about radical innovation. I think a lot of us have, or defensive publications, or different types of things that might be happening. And so I asked about defending products from invention and competitive threats, experimenting with big risky ideas, incremental changes as solutions to problems or others, which was open-ended. And they said things like reading academic papers, which I found interesting. And we didn't see any difference, again, in the engineer's self-reported risk-taking across gender. So I don't think it's basically once you are selected in this firm, you're not having a difference in your time allocation. You're not having a difference in your risk attitudes. It's got to be that. So think back to our model, then it's got to be about this refining of the patent worthiness of your idea. Okay, and so this is where then we put, this is the survey data. It's the same regression as before, but with the survey data. And again, we see it negative across basically all of these settings, but here we can go through and put in a wide variety of controls. So we're putting in demographics. When we're doing that, that means we're putting in education, work experience, age, region, business unit. When we're putting in identity, we had questions about confidence. We had questions about what did you identify as a problem solver, stuff like that. For culture, we put in all of these questions that we had about culture. And again, we're not recreating stuff. So for the culture stuff, I actually used the exact questions we used in the Graham et al. Study. And similarly for the management, we used exact questions that had been previously used on some of the management surveys. And so we're seeing that, you know, this seems to be a robust finding, and it's a robust to like the inclusion of all these controls and explanations in some ways. So this leads us to say, well, what's then is most influential here? And so we're going into a pecking order of factors. Okay, so again, you know, I help build enterprise software. I look like an engineer. I think there might be people thinking it could be many things. It could be self-identity, confidence, motivation, rewards, all of these things. And so we put everything together and we came up with a pecking order. And the way we did it is through surveying techniques, where you ask a question repeatedly, but you frame it in different ways. And so then when framing across the different responses, and so one is open-ended, but it's also a positive and a negative framing, we can see, and we can triangulate through these responses to see, you know, what seems to be most salient across these settings. Management practices comes out number one. Number two is motivation in both intrinsic and extrinsic. 3 is corporate culture. 4 is the submission process itself, so the bias and complexity. 5 is mentoring. 6 is peer influence, and 7 is sort of personal characteristics. So what I think is really unique is that these ones that are lower are the ones that are actually the ones we've really studied in the literature before, because that's about the self-selection into the firm. And I think then once you're there, it really seems to be much more about these firm-specific things, okay? And so I'm going to just go into one to, I'm probably going to do management and culture to give you a sense, because those are 2 I really like. But the management, so it's the number 1 factor from the open-ended questions. And then what do we say? Because we have more detailed questions. Female engineers' perception of managerial support is significantly lower, and the disparities seem to arise from project assignments. Women are less likely to be included in projects likely to yield patentable inventions. Their managers are biased in putting them in something. It's the top 2 factors women perceive as preventing idea submission, or I don't feel like the work I do is likely to yield patentable inventions, and I'm too busy with other work. So again, they're being put on other assignments. And then this distinct path for URMs might be explained by management, right? URMs are significantly higher, 12 percentage points higher than females, to say that they are encouraged to submit ideas by their managers. They also indicate significantly higher rates that management support their career development and that they're proactive about removing barriers to inventiveness. Okay. Skip that one. Okay. And then now I'm going to focus on culture, because that was sort of one I wanted to understand too. So we think of culture as sort of an informal institution. It was the number 3 factor out of 12 from the idea submission question, and number 3 also from the open-ended questions. What it allowed us to do then was to look at what specific values, because I had asked about values, okay? And what we learned is that maybe building better norms for collaboration and reinforcing that could help. So URMs say that info sharing is the number 1 cultural norm, helping them to invent, and it's significantly higher for them. But for women, it's significantly lower. They claim that their managers don't explain important details to them. So there's no information sharing. And females are significantly less likely to not have people with whom to collaborate. So there's no team mentality. Similarly for integrity, right? You want to build a better norm to reinforce this value, right? All URGs say, and URGs is a combination of URM and female, say holding employees accountable for unjust actions is a cultural weakness at their firm. And it works against invention. We were clear to ask about working against invention. They also Females report significantly lower levels of trust, and they are also significantly less likely to experience leadership making ethical and fair decisions. Okay, and so this is sort of what we think of as why these are big barriers, but these are things you can change. Okay, and so with that, that leads us to sort of ask our next question, which is why does the gender gap matter, and sort of what ideas are we losing? And so what we're doing here is we are literally just taking these sampled firms, or these firms that have been collaborating, giving us survey and idea databases, and we're pulling them from the public USPTO data, right? And we're saying, hey, what does it look like? And actually, this surprised me, right? Because if you typically run female on patents, you're going to get a negative coefficient. It's pretty well established in the literature. And I found a positive coefficient. It's a positive in the raw, and when I put controls in, I'm putting a bunch of controls in. I'm putting in backward citations, examiner citations, claims, firm size, all of these firm characteristics, as well as, firm, headquarter state, technology class, and application year fixed effects. So it really is evident there for these firms. And it's evident when you look at the lead female inventor too. So it's actually stronger when we look at the lead female inventor. Okay, so being female is correlated with more citations in these sampled firms. That contrasts with the typical pattern. This suggests that the marginal missing idea is actually high quality. So going from there, and I love this image, I got it from Dolly. This is the bro culture. Maybe as a robustness, is it what I think it is, which is that these sampled firms are saying management's really bad and the culture is like not supporting our innovation? Okay, well, if we know that there's these frictions, can we therefore check the generalizability of our findings by looking at Glassdoor, which both has a 5-star rating system for culture and for management? And so what we do is do this, but now we can have 100, we can have lots of firms in this observations in our sample. And what I'm really focusing on is this interaction term. So the negative on female inventor comes back, right? But what you see is this interaction term, and why I define an effective culture is just below median in Glassdoor ratings, and ineffective management or poor management is the same thing, below median. That it's actually positive. The interaction term is positive. So again, this is consistent evidence for sort of high quality patents by female inventors being lost at these firms that sort of have meaningful frictions in the invention process. Okay. And these controls here, again, we're putting in all of the controls that we did before. So it's really hard to come up with a story where once you put in, technology class, headquarter state, firm, and application year, that you're getting back to a world where that this wouldn't be the case. Actually, these don't have firm fixed effects because I needed the poor management and ineffective culture. So they're cross-sectional ones. Sorry, now that I'm like just looking at it and thinking about it. Okay, so other robustness checks. Just sort of more simple stuff about the surveys. So, you might think that it's a biased set of people because it was a DEI thing. And we tried to work with these firms and help them craft solicitation emails, but, you can't totally control what they do. And so what we do is we actually got them to put, because many of them have regular, engagement survey metrics. We got them to put 2 of the exact same questions on their regular engagement survey metrics, and we basically show that the results are statistically indistinguishable. You could also think that it's sort of just self-serving, and so maybe that's not really true. I think a lot of the work that we had just shown you to externally validate and say, hey, the IDF database matches the other database is sort of the way we went at that. But then there's other things that maybe it's something that we're missing. And so we thought about this more too. And we said, one of the big picture things is this is an international sample. And so maybe, Americans have a different construction of race and gender. And so we run actually every table for just Americans and find very similar results. And then another thing that somebody said is, actually, this all happens at school and universities. It doesn't actually happen in the workplace. Now, this is maybe one of the more striking ones. It is in our appendix, but very different perceptions students had. We just did it with a bunch of students last year in spring semester. They do not have these same perceptions. I asked them questions about how much time they think they'll spend on inventive tasks and all these things, and we see differences. So it's something about being in the firm that is changing your mindset. And knowing the management literature well, I think this is totally consistent. The value, I've always loved Eddie Luzier's paper on the value of a bad boss. It's 6 months, and you basically all of like the gains you might have had from a good boss or a prior great career are destroyed by a bad boss. Okay. So with that, what I think we've done in this paper is sort of present novel data on the innovator-inventor gap. Invention is an opt-in competitive process, okay? There is meaningful fallout across stages of the patenting process. Only a third of engineers submit ideas. Half of those ideas are rejected internally. We see URMs and females experience distinct paths. So women, but not URMs, are disadvantaged across stages. Being females associated with a 5 to 9 percentage point, it depends on which specification, decrease in advancing to the next step. We think of this female disadvantage as consistent with sort of the competitiveness literature in other settings where females don't like to opt in. Then we have our model of idea submission to derive the pecking order. And really, I think what it's showing is management really matters. Extrinsic and intrinsic motivation matter, and I didn't go into that as much. There is some evidence that pro-social motivation seems to matter more for certain engineers. And then culture matters a lot. And they make an effort to determine the patent worthiness. It's more costly for females. And then finally, our results support this idea that the marginal lost invention is high quality. We do an analysis of the citation patterns, and it suggests that high quality patents are lost at firms with these larger gender gaps. So with that, I want to say, thank you. Come pilot with us. In particular, we're hosting a conference at Emory University in September. I'm looking to put together a panel on sort of empirically diversity in patenting and intellectual property papers. So if you have them, certainly feel free to reach out. I would love to, even highlight it on our blog series or anything like that. And Margot is another principal, and this is all founded by Colleen, who does just terrific work, getting everybody together and enthusiastic about this topic. And so, appreciate Rem's comments and any questions anybody else may have. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Jill, for this very interesting presentation. So Rem is the discussant. So if you want to share your slides, and go ahead.
Yeah, let me get that set up.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to stop your screen sharing. There we go. Desktop 3. Oh, okay. Let me just organize here. Great.
Stop sharing.
Yeah.
I did push my stop, but it's still circling.
Oh yeah, it does say you're both sharing. Hold on.
Oh, we're both sharing. Wow. I didn't know that was
According to the,
possible.
hold on. Okay. Is everyone, there we go.
Okay, I am screen sharing now, which is good, but hold on 1 second. It has now decided, there we go. My mouse disappeared. Let me just get a little organized here and I will get us going. Okay, great. So you guys can see that now? Perfect. Okay, cool. Open this up a little bit. I can then see all of you. Perfect. Okay, so excited. My name is Rem. I'm an associate professor here at HBS. Excited to talk about this super cool paper on unpacking the innovator-inventor gap. Let me just start with like a brief summary. I know we all just saw it. But I think it's useful just to sort of set what I like about the paper. So it's an unpacking paper. Let me unpack the unpacking to start. There are tables and tables and tables. Like, just go look at the tables. There are like different papers, different ideas, all sorts of cool stuff, because they have this amazing survey data of unpacking the innovation process by gender and race. They have a stylized model of the innovation process, background qualitative interviews, and then all the data. So I don't think, Jillian, really, you should shout more about just how amazing this data is. Rich survey data on engineers from nearly 4,000 workers at 4 different companies. You have nearly 70,000 unique ideas submitted for IP review, Glassdoor reviews, patents, public firm financials, all this good stuff. So I just think the data is incredibly rich. And lets them tell a really interesting story, delving into the organizational and management processes that matter for innovation, right? I think often we think of patents as just coming from people, but a huge amount come from firms. And I think the sort of firm organizational management processes really have been overlooked, mainly because of data limitations, that we can't see it. So I love what this data lets them do. The paper currently is framed around bias and costly signals. So I just took a quote from the paper. It says, conceptually, going from idea to invention does not solely depend on the quality of the idea, but also signals to the innovator of an idea's patent worthiness. I have another quote here on the sort of costliness of generating these signals. And sort of reading the paper, at first I was super excited about this framing. Mike has a cool paper talking about gender and race and entrepreneurial finance. I just published a paper with Raman Ananda and Sam Cow on sampling bias and entrepreneurial experiments. And I think there's sort of a larger frame that you see in the sort of entrepreneurship space broadly, which is that you have some entrepreneur, they have an idea and they need to get signals about their idea, right? That could be through a lean startup thing, that could be through sort of sequential financial investments, and there could be variation in how costly it is to get those signals. Right. And the paper's framed around that, which I think is a workhorse that we see in the entrepreneurship and innovation literature, right? This is often like how we like to sort of set up this problem and then understand where biases are coming from. And indeed, they really roll with that. And we saw Julian at the end sort of going there, which is that if the gap is driven by worse signals of patent worthiness, so basically if we're going from inventive ideas all the way to a patent application being filed, if I'm getting poor signals at each stage of this sequence, right? And we heard her make this argument, which I think is great, right? It's that the only ideas from female inventors that are going to make it are the ones where they have private information that this is a really, really good idea. So if it's really hard for me to get signals, or signals are costly, or they're noisy, we can, model it in a bunch of different ways, right? We would expect the only ones to make it to the end to be the ones that are the best, right? If I can sort of ascertain the quality of my idea, at least a little bit in this process, right? And indeed, they show this, I think really a really interesting table on Ford citations, right? Which is that only the best ideas from female inventors in the 4 firms they study seem to get patented. So if it has a female inventor, you have this really positive effect on Ford citations. Or I have in the bottom here, they do it just in terms of, do you end up with a patent in the top decile of citations, right? Similar effects here. Then things get weird, is sort of Julian sort of mentioned, right? Which is that the outcome tests look really different in the sample of listed firms. So when they move out of the 4 firms they survey to all firms, they get this big negative effect, right? And that's like weird, like what's the difference? And they propose one way to rationalize it, which is with this neat interaction of looking at the interaction between whether the patent has a female inventor and whether the firm has an ineffective culture or poor management. Right. And sort of like, oh, it becomes more positive in those firms because it's harder for women to make it out. So the ideas they end up moving forward are more positive. And I think this is a potential rationalization. Though I think there are some reasons for skepticism. And I think it really goes back to sort of the underlying idea of looking at the organizational and managerial processes in these firms. And the reason I think there's sort of a little bit of reason for skepticism in this interaction, and I think more broadly just in outcome tests, is that I'm not sure I trust outcome tests, right? And there's a footnote in the paper that mentions this, but I'd like to walk through because I think actually not trusting an outcomes test in this setting might actually lead to, I think, some rich data analysis that could be done in this paper to really push literature forward. So let me walk you through basically what outcome tests are doing and a sort of simple stylized example that I've stolen from this phenomenal paper called The Problem of Inframarginality and Outcome Tests for Discrimination. In this paper, Camila, Sam, and Sharad they're studying discrimination in police stops. Right, and whether you find contraband. I've stolen an example from their paper and mapped it to the patenting one. And I want to walk through it because I think it's really illustrative of something that I think is missing from the paper that I think Colleen and Julian can really get at moving forward. So here's a numerical example of the outcome test logic. I'm going to show you a graph in a second, but I want you to assume that 71% of ideas from men are patented. So of all the ideas that they have, 71% are patented, 64% for women, right? And then here, what I'm going to show you some distributions in a second. Only 39% of patents from men are in the Ford citation top decile, assume 44% for women. So this would be a classic example of where we have sort of outcome test differences, right? Women conditional on patenting seem to have patents that are better. And often I think in our head, we think something like this is going on, right? So men ideas are the red line. The blue idea are female ideas. You see a little difference in the distributions, but they're similar. The x-axis here is the probability that the idea is a top decile patent. And basically what those dashed lines are different thresholds for men and women. And basically what we're saying is the threshold for men to make, have their ideas make it to being patented is lower, right, in terms of the probability that it's going to be a really good patent, right, than for women. And I think we call that discrimination often, right? And so we look at this and we say, man, when we see these outcome tests, I think in our head, we have this idea that women have this higher threshold. It's more costly to get the signals, managers are biased, we can come up with lots of different mechanisms in that. The issue is, and this paper really does, I think, an excellent job of talking about this, is that we're implicitly assuming that the idea distribution's basically the same for men and women. Here, there's a little bit of difference, but we're basically assuming it's the same and we're shifting the underlying thresholds. However, I can get exactly the same statistics that you see at the top with the following thresholds and distributions. So here, I'm assuming that women have a much higher variance distribution. So they're more likely to have really, really good patents, right? Ideas that are going to really make it to the top decile, and more likely to have really, really bad patents, right? If you assume this distribution instead, and the thresholds I show you, you find exactly the same evidence from an outcome test. Even though if you look at this figure in the right, what you see is that actually the threshold for men, the red dashed line, is higher than the threshold for women. So if we were saying implicitly where's discrimination, in the one on the right, even though it has the same, right, basically like statistics that we see on the top, what we're seeing is that men actually face a higher threshold for getting their ideas to become patents than women, right? And this is crazy. And really, why is this happening? This is the problem of inframarginality, right? It's hard for us to infer what's happening to the marginal patent by looking at all patents that make it into being, all ideas that make it into being patents versus all ideas that don't, right? We really want to look at that margin. We can struggle to look at that, particularly if these distributions are different. I encourage you to read the paper. I think it just does a really good job of describing the problem. The reason I raise this problem here is I think a lot of the statistics and tables in the paper suggest that there's going to be differences in the underlying idea distribution across men and women. And I think that's something you should really lean into, and I think that's really powerful, right? So let me turn to that in a second, right? Which is that, right, managers assign tasks, which is super duper different than I think a lot of the papers that Mike cites in his review piece, or the entrepreneurs that are working on in the paper I have with Ramana and Sam, where there is no organization. So in the case of the market, people are choosing what ideas they want to work on. Working at these large tech firms, having known a lot of people who work there, a big downside is you don't get to choose what you work on, right? Someone is telling you you're working on this or you're transferred to this division. And I think that's really important, a little bit missing in the model that we see, right? I think if I look at some of the statistics that are there, right, there's reason to think women might have even less choice. They tend to be younger and have less experience, which might mean that they get assigned to projects that have less sort of patent or innovation potential, right? I thought there's a statistic in table 3 that is just amazing. Men and women are, right, in response to the question, men and women are equally assigned to projects that lead to inventive disclosures. Women are significantly less likely to agree. There's a big gap there. Right? They just do not agree that this is the case, which I think suggests, again, going back to this, that there may be underlying differences in the idea distribution that are really interesting and also make it really problematic to interpret outcome tests. Finally, I think you have superb organizational and managerial survey data, but the framing model is largely silent. There's a little bit on the feedback, but I think digging into how it might change the assignment of which ideas to work on would be really, really fruitful and really, really interesting, right? And so this is all super high level, right? Let me try to make it a little bit concrete. I hope you have access to this data, which is that I don't know if you have the text of the ideas that are submitted. I really, really hope you do, right? Because if you do, I think then you have, like, it levels this paper up like 5 levels. It's already really good, but it takes it to just like amazing, amazing, because you could actually, for ideas that are not patented, understand if there are differences across men and women in terms of topics, technology, novelty. Personally, I think the simplest one would be to take some recent papers. I'm gonna, my advisor, Sharkasan, who's now at Duke with an amazing grad student, Roger Mascalons, and Wes Cohen, who I'm sure many of you know. They have a really cool paper where they're using NLP, AI, whatever you want to call it, models, basically to estimate commercialization potential for a scientific article. I wonder if you could take their method and apply it to the nearly 70,000 ideas that you have to really directly measure whether you see men and women are working on equally commercializable ideas and whether then there are lost ideas because of frictions in the intellectual property process. I think even without the text data, I hope you have the text data or could get the text data, there are methods you could use to try to back out the differences in distributions. The paper explains one method. I think there are others that you could use. I'd really love to see the model extended to that to really go along the pipeline, because I think that initial assignment of what you work on fundamentally makes a huge difference. A bunch of additional feedback. I can send the deck over later. I'm going to just quickly highlight a couple. I'd love to see more figures and plots of the raw data. It's such cool data. I think just more of it would be absolutely amazing. I think the presence of an IP submission system, and this is where I just don't know enough, Colleen, I think you might be the expert here. Is that an important boundary condition, right? The fact that they record all these ideas, does that change the nature of submission? Does that bias gaps downwards or upwards? I struggle to think about that a little bit. There's one firm that really dominates the sample that has 65,000 of the nearly 70,000 ideas. So, I think thinking about, do you talk about it as 4 firms or 1 firm is interesting. And then finally, that I want to mention is more IP good, right? So I'm thinking a little bit about the Klein et al. Paper, right? They show that women make less money, right, when the firm patents. And if that's the case, maybe they're just like, yeah, okay, I could turn it into IP, but I'm going to make less off of it. Let's just do the inventive idea, but without the intellectual property. There's social returns to that. That's still wonderful, right? But they're less interested in the sort of value capture part of it, right? This speaks a little bit to Jorge Guzman's work, has some stuff on this as well. And so I wonder a little bit on this one of the inventive versus ideas, right? You can be very inventive and, do lots of really cool stuff. So we talk about a lot like lost Curies. But what's interesting is we know the Curies actually were vehemently against patenting. So it's maybe not the right thing to use when we're analyzing innovation, though it is a good phrase. And then finally, let me end on this, and then I'll open it up to questions. I think I'm running 2 minutes long, which is that the tables are amazing. So I just picked one of the tables, and I think there's so much you can learn from just looking at these tables and looking where the differences are across the different groups. I was pretty interested in the fact that, have you ever attended an IP training? And you see that like women are much more likely to do it through an affinity group. So creating groups of women who are being exposed to this. I just thought that was like an absolutely fascinating, interesting descriptive. And I could go on that. But overall, I think a really great paper, lots to dig into. Thanks for giving me a chance to read it and discuss it today.